Thanks, Tim. That was helpful. And Brother Bill Lliorca is going to be sharing now. I believe it's a counterpoint message. Is that correct? The only way for the church to speak prophetically is to not do so at all and to soothe consciences into voting however they want. Somewhere in that ballpark. All right, Bill, come on up.
Well, good morning. It's good to be here. Good to see all your smiling faces. Thanks for coming out on this Saturday morning when you could be doing other things. 2020 has been, iconic, I guess, for several reasons. Riots in the streets, police brutality, statutory masking mandates, school shutdowns, national monuments destroyed, and apparent vigilantism where police and civil servants refuse to protect their citizens and their communities. Certainly, 2020 is now something of a byword and a curse. You know, stub your toe, that hurt like 2020. Having a difficult day at work, oh, today went all 2020 on me. And it's the year I finally got glasses, so maybe 2020 there too. We are in Chinese proverbial times. Interesting. And more than interesting and less humorous, we seem to be at an ever clearer point of crisis, where before now, we have had more civilized discussions across the political aisle, not completely, but a little more. Now there is only suspicion and growing distrust regarding political opponents. Even more concerning, our country has been so politicized that it seems that we can no longer have, neighbors and fellow citizens and friends who happen to hold to different social, cultural, and political views than we do. No, we are now reduced to the alienating they and the politicized them. And it may be cliche, but the plain truth is that we are an extremely divided country. If our country were a political marriage, the dishes are being thrown, the lawyers are being called, and divorce is not just considered, but the papers are awaiting signatures. We are unable to see our future with them, nor they with us, whichever them or us you happen to be. To riff off of Woody Allen, the American future is not what it used to be. It seems the ground beneath our feet is shaking, culturally and politically speaking. What's happening? What is this? Well, we're experiencing a collision of two opposing religions. Progressivism on one hand and Christianity on the other. Specifically, the point of impact is over the word freedom, which is in large part descriptive of our national heritage. More specifically, we are at radical odds over the worldview that upholds this freedom, this American freedom that we've inherited. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what freedom we've forgotten, and then also describe to you what is now being promoted as freedom. And hopefully we'll see how these things are colliding and causing such problems. First of all, for freedom forgotten, that America was founded largely under the influence of Christianity along with her constitutional liberties is the truth largely forgotten. But memory, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and it seems we are recalling a very different vision of liberty today than originally established in the English colonies here in America and enshrined in our political documents. So let's try to recall, in very broad strokes, the character of American liberty as it was established and grew in the 17th and 18th century. And then we'll compare the opposing vision of liberty. And we'll start with a sermon that was actually preached by the Presbyterian Samuel Miller on July 4th, 1793, in celebration of Independence Day. And he says this: "In contemplating the national advantages and national happiness, Numerous are the objects which present themselves to a wise and reflecting patriot. While he remembers the past with thankfulness and triumph, and while he looks forward with glowing anticipation to future glories, he will by no means forget to inquire into the secret springs, which had an active influence in the former, and which there is reason to believe will be equally connected with the latter. And what he's trying to get us to remember is what were the secret springs, the true source of American liberty. So let's try to do the same. When the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts in 1607, she brought with her not only passengers, but the fruits of Western Christian liberties. Stowed within the collective memory of those on board were generations of Christian faith and practice. Those on board believed God had created a good creation. Man was his image bearer and thus had dignity and a calling. But man was fallen and prone to evil, so governments were divinely established to protect human life for the purpose of advancing the gospel. And those aboard drafted the first constitutional document. She was chartered specifically for the purpose of advancing the gospel, and those aboard drafted the first constitutional document in America, which was called the Mayflower Compact. And George Bancroft said this was where constitutional liberty was born, in the cabin of the Mayflower. And not only the Pilgrims in Plymouth, but Christians in Virginia and elsewhere were on a specifically Christian mission, carrying with them English liberties that had been forged with the help of Christians in their ages-long struggle against tyranny. The Magna Carta was one such English treasure. Contracted in 1215 between King John and several English barons, it restricted the king from imprisoning barons without trial, illegal confiscation of land, no taxation without representation, and justice could no longer be sold or denied to free men. Sound familiar? This was the legal tradition that landed and began to grow in the American colonies. And this great charter was a forerunner to our own Bill of Rights. The Mayflower Compact began in the name of God, amen. And the several American colonies followed their religious lead when drafting their own constitutions. A. Hodge records this: Connecticut gave the first example of a written constitution, recognizes, quote, the providence of Almighty God. He goes on, they established their political commonwealth, quote, to maintain and preserve the gospel of our Lord Jesus, and believed, quote, the scriptures hold forth a perfect rule for the direction and government of all men and all duties they are to perform to God and man. Province of Pennsylvania, first act of legislature, 1682. Government in itself is a venerable ordinance of God. Its goal? To make and establish such laws as shall best preserve true Christian and civil liberty in opposition to unchristian, licentious, and unjust practices. Colonial New York legislature, 1665, ordered churches to be built in each parish and ministers to preach every Sunday. South Carolina, chartered by Charles II, 1662, declared that pious zeal for the propagation of the gospel led them to establish their colony. Its second charter permitted non-Christians and dissenters to form churches so long as they acknowledged the existence of God and that he ought to be worshiped, and that every man recognized divine justice, human responsibility, and this by legal testimony to the magistrate. This is a Christian worldview that was backing all of this. And it set up what we could call constitutional liberty. We noted that historian George Bancroft said constitutional liberty was born in the cabin of the Mayflower. This constitutional liberty had a few features to it. One, it was what you might call covenantal. It bound all parties involved equally under the law. Specifically English common law, which was an amalgam, a mixture of biblical law and local custom. And it was legal. It had negative sanctions applied for breaking this bond, whether king or vassal, ruler or citizen. It was public. And this was a social bond. If broken, it destroyed the foundations of society and public welfare. They understood this. That's why in North Carolina, they required that you acknowledge the existence of God and that you had responsibility to them. A citizen that didn't do that, you couldn't even keep them in this social bond. What was called the commonweal or commonwealth was what was to be protected. And this was the legal and social capital held in common by all. It was a commonwealth. It was written. It was recorded for all to see, understand, and memorialize for future generations, and accessible through courts for redress. But not only did we get these legal treasures through the Magna Carta and the settlements in colonial America, we also had an amazing institution of Christian education, amazing institutions. They recognized Christianity as the highest aim of education. Harvard, named for Reverend John Harvard, designed its 1692 seal with 3 open books, across which is inscribed the Latin Veritas for truth, and underneath a banner reading Christo et Ecclesiae, truth for Christ and the church. Prior to this, in 1650, its motto was In Gloriam Christo, for the glory of Christ. And they adopted this rule for their education. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom is the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. Professors of William and Mary College had to be members of the Anglican Church and taught the catechism. Yale, founded by Congregationalists, had this as its aim: sincere regard and zeal for upholding and propagating of the Christian Protestant religion by a succession of learned and orthodox men, wherein youth may be instructed in the arts and sciences, who through the blessing of Almighty God may be fitted for public employment in church and civil state. They understood well, Henry Van Til, that culture is religion externalized. Thus they enculturated this vision. Many other learning institutions besides were explicitly Christian in their goals and in their studies. This, of course, was true for primary education as well. Many colonial children had been raised on the New England Primer, which you can buy today, which taught them their ABCs like this. A, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. B, thy life to amend, this book attend, the Bible. C, the cat doth play, and after slay. Many prints also contain the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which begins, what is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And this prayer, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. That was how it was actually popularized, was through the New England Primer. Christian education in early America assumed and strengthened a common language, a universe of discourse, a worldview, apart from which words like liberty, tyranny, equality, and government have no meaning. What about the American Revolution, the war for American independence? Without Christianity, our independence would never have been secured. This is also a truth largely forgotten. Many of us remember and are familiar with the 3 great leaders of the American Revolution. Patrick Henry, the trumpet of the Revolution, give me liberty or give me death. Thomas Jefferson, the pen of the Revolution. And of course, the sword of the Revolution, George Washington. All 3 of these great architects of American freedom saw Christianity as the source of liberty. To a greater or lesser degree, Tim mentioned Tom Jefferson's deism. It was a quiet deism, though. It wouldn't have been accepted very well. But there is one major artifact missing from this list of trumpet, pen, and sword: the pulpit of the Revolution. In fact, there were many American revolutionary pulpits. To the pulpit, says 18th century lawyer John Thornton, to the pulpit, the Puritan pulpit, we owe the moral force which won our independence. Just a quick glance through the 2-volume series by Ellis Sandoz, Political Sermons of the American Founding Era, will quickly dispel any doubts as to Thornton's claim. To the pulpit, the Puritan pulpit, we owe the moral force which won our independence. That's an awesome statement. Their contemporaries, too, attested to this Puritan-led independence. It was the Presbyterians especially that continued the theological tradition of the Puritans in America, many of them fresh from Scotland and their religious wars with England still boiling in their grandfather's memory. Just a century earlier, the Scottish Presbyterian and Puritan Samuel Rutherford, 1600 to 1661, co-author of the Westminster Confession and Catechisms, wrote Lex Rex, which means the law is king, and is helpful to understanding the Protestant political mindset of colonial America. He gave devastating arguments to the effect that kings were subject to law no less than their subjects, and this at a time when kings claimed divine rights, such as left them virtually untouchable. Similar in subject and argument to Rutherford's Lex Rex is a book titled A Vindication of Liberty Against Tyrants. Now, R.J. Rushdoony claims it was held by John Adams to be the most influential book on the eve of the Reformation. And he summarizes the book's arguments. First, any ruler who commands anything contrary to the law of God thereby forfeits his realm. Second, rebellion is refusal to obey God rather than men. Third, since God's law is the fundamental law and the only true source of law, and neither king nor subject is exempt from it, war is sometimes required to defend God's law against the ruler. The fourth tenet also characterized this position. Legal rebellion required the leadership of lesser magistrates to oppose, in the name of law, royal dissolution or contempt of the law. All these doctrines were basic to the colonial cause. Now, who was it that led the charge in the war for American independence? Lesser magistrates, their representatives. But all this is to say that the revolutionary pulpit, the Puritan pulpit, was critical for the winning and forging of American liberty. So much so that the ministers were known as the Black Regiment, due to their black Genevan gowns. The Prime Minister of England said, "Cousin America has run away with the Presbyterian parson," most likely referring to Presbyterian Dr. John Witherspoon, due to his heavy influence on American resistance. He was also a signer of the Declaration, member of Congress, and president of Princeton. Indeed, Cousin America had run away with the Presbyterian parson. And historical evidence also suggests strongly that King George III considered the American Revolution as something of a specifically Presbyterian rebellion. The American Rebellion, though, was not in the strictest sense of the terms a revolution. And this is important to understand, this principle of liberty under law. That's what these men wanted. They wanted redress. One author put it this way: one of the basic premises of the American system, in a basic article of Christian faith, is that man's liberty is under law. They were not attempting to abolish law and order, but reestablish law and order. Their cry was, "We are free Englishmen." When the king or parliament broke the law, acted out of accord with their charter, it was an act of tyranny and upset the legal order necessary for true liberty. Again, theirs was a constitutional liberty, documented for all to see. Tyranny was thus seen as lawlessness with a crown. Anarchy was just a tyranny of the masses, tyranny without a crown. And this is the key point. Christian liberty is precluded by a legal order. Christian liberty is constrained and defined, not unconstrained and undefined. Rushdoony says liberty goes hand in hand with responsibility. Rulers have responsibility to the people, and the people have responsibility to their rulers. But beyond this, rulers and people had responsibility and duty to God. And this chimes well with Lord Acton's pithy remark. He said this: "A right may be abandoned, not a duty." So liberty is less secure as a right than as an obligation. I'm going to read that again. A right may be abandoned, not a duty. So liberty is less secure as a right than as an obligation. Notice what's being said here. Liberty is required to be responsible to God, to respond to God's claim on your life, fulfilling your God-given duties. If God gives the duty, no man may take that away from you arbitrarily. It was this principle of God-given rights that provoked the writing of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Oh, they changed it. It was property, but happiness, which is rather vague. We should have kept property. Yeah. To take away these things, accordingly, was to deprive a person of the very thing that made them human, to assume a sort of godhood and take that which only God could give. Tyrants seek to be God, specifically by unmanning man. Because God made the world a certain way, tyranny at bottom is not only dehumanizing, but sinful and unnatural. So liberty, accordingly, as it was received, was responsible stewardship. It was responsible stewardship is what it was. And what they were attempting to provide when they set up our government, or our political documents, rather, was room for them to be responsible stewards. The First Amendment basically is protection of the conscience. You are supposed to be a steward of your conscience, right? The government is not, contrary to popular opinion, in the business of invoking thought crime. Should not be. Amen. Right? That's a First Amendment issue. The Second Amendment is you're responsible for your protection. You ever see the times on 911 when somebody calls? Oftentimes they don't get there in time. Right? You need to be armed. There's a reason. It's a dangerous world. The principle of liberty under law had several implications, the first of which is something already mentioned. The world is not arbitrary, but governed by God. Because God is not arbitrary, God's laws are not arbitrary. This means Christian rulers and constitutions must submit to God, avoid arbitrary rule that is destructive to society. They're not allowed to just make it up as they go. Another way to say this is that a Christian political vision is a constrained political vision. This is from Thomas Sowell. And Brian Mattson explains it this way. This is not a cosmos, a universe, of pure possibility or pure chance, in which we might make of the world what we would like it to be. This is a God-ordained, structured reality. It displays both a magnificent unity as well as diversity. But the universe is not simply orderly, it is ordered for a purpose. And Genesis 1 does not leave us in suspense as to what that purpose is. The cosmos was purposed for human flourishing. Just governments help to protect human flourishing. And it was this responsible stewardship as the basis of liberty that was the basis of our protecting human liberty. Basically, what they assumed was this, is that man has dignity because of Genesis 1:26. Let us create man in our image. Man has a purpose. And God blessed them. God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion. Tim already alluded to that, already referenced that, the dominion covenant. It's a covenant of stewardship. Though imperfect, those Americans who first laid the political foundations of our nation understood this God-ordained structured reality. A very crucial part of the structure is our unalienable rights, our duties before God. They also believed that man was fallen and that civil government was instituted to maintain justice, but not recreate it out of thin air. No human institution could perfect man. That's another thing they didn't believe. They didn't believe in the perfectibility of man. This is also why they had divided powers. They understood man was prone to not exercise responsible stewardship, but irresponsible domination. No human institution could perfect man. Something deeper than human government they understood was necessary for liberty. I mentioned Samuel Miller earlier giving the sermon on the celebration of independence. And he understood, and he points to the secret springs of American liberty when he says this something deeper necessary for man's perfection. The truth is, he said, that political liberty does not rest solely on the form of government under which a nation may happen to live. It does not consist altogether in the arrangement or in the balance of power, nor even the rights and privileges which the Constitution offers to every citizen. These indeed must be acknowledged to have a considerable effect in its promotion or decline. But we shall find on a close inspection that something else is of equal, if not greater importance. What is it? Well, he says this: it must have its seat in the hearts and dispositions of those individuals which compose the body politic. And it is with the hearts and dispositions of men that Christianity is conversant. When, therefore, that perfect law of liberty, which this holy religion includes, prevails and governs in the minds of all, their freedom rests upon a basis more solid and immovable than human wisdom can devise. For the obvious tendency of this divine system in all its parts is, in the language of its great author, to bring deliverance to the captives and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to undo the heavy burdens, and to the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. For Miller, it was God's work of grace in us, what we call regeneration. For Miller, regeneration was the secret spring of liberty. That was the source. It wasn't our constitutional form of government, though good. The answer lied in the text he used for a sermon, 2 Corinthians 3:17, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. According to the Bible, man is in bondage to sin under its power and governance. In this sense, sin is first and foremost the universal tyrant to be resisted. Sin is the reason we're in bondage. Sin is the reason we don't have liberty, as we should. Sin and death are in the Bible made as an analogy for the Egyptian taskmasters demanding more bricks and without straw. Deliverance in the minds of Christians and Hebrews before them was a very historical deliverance, a deliverance from Pharaoh. And he delivered them to freedom under God's law. When the Spirit indwells a person, he frees him from the power of sin. But not only does the Spirit free us from our sin, he frees us from the fear of others sinning against us, trying to force us into slavery. You'd rather die than disobey God. It was this Spirit who gave courage to the midwives in Egypt who refused to kill the Hebrew babies, who gave Rahab courage to mislead the soldiers of Jericho, who gave Daniel courage in the lion's den, who gave the apostles courage to say, we must obey God rather than men. Thus, Jefferson, resisting tyranny is obedience to God. To be human, a free human, means obedience to the God of nature and nature's God. It was this echo from Exodus reverberating in Patrick Henry's trumpet, give me liberty or give me death. So free people create a free form of government in harmony with God's order. This is what Tim was alluding to in culture being an externalization of religion. Our political culture that we received was an externalization of these people's religion. But here's the rub. Only a people freed from sin will find God's law, and those laws based on God's law, to be a law of liberty. As St. Paul said, God gave the Spirit that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, Romans 8:4. But those without the Spirit will not find it as a law of liberty because they cannot submit to God's law, Romans 8:7. Does this mean that everyone that helped establish our political order was a Christian? No, of course not. What it does mean, though, is that the national character had been so shaped and disciplined by Christianity that the Christian idea of freedom had been so ingrained in their minds as to become a kind of common sense. Seem like we've lost a kind of common sense? A. Hodge confirms this. He says this, that the English common law is the creature of Christianity has never been questioned. This has grown and been confirmed by the habits and legislation of our really Christian people through the 250 years in which our institutions have been growing on American soil. It's almost 400 now since he said that. And in doing, they have spread through all our zones, over all our mountains and plains, a mass or precedents, half unconscious traditions, self-executing habits, self-discipline, instincts, prejudices of our millions of people. So incredibly Christianized was our nation that Hodge ended this statement like this: it would be a Herculean task to undo by positive legislation in 1,000 years. Our people would not if they could, and they could not if they would. A Herculean task. Let's now talk about those Herculean efforts, specifically the radical change that progressives have so assiduously brought about to our nation. What is progressivism? Well, progressivism is socialism for Westerners. Early on, the European socialists and communists understood that naked socialism could not be sold to a very wealthy people comprised of property owners. There was no proletariat to rise up. First, socialism has as its basic goal the abolition of private property. So here it was packaged differently and marketed under quote-unquote progressivism. And it peaked under Woodrow Wilson, especially under the War Industrial Bureau, that co-opted vast sections of American business for emergency war efforts. And it's been ratcheted up again and again. But instead of a society of sphere sovereignty that we heard, independent areas of responsibility, free enterprise, and property, progressivism sees society as one single organism. William Lind lists the requirements of progressivism vision. This is interesting. Government and labor representation on the board of every corporation, sharing the profits of public service companies, government ownership of the means of communication, government ownership of the means of transportation, a comprehensive system of old age pension, government ownership of all health care, full labor protection, and governmental arbitration of industrial disputes. Sounds like Hercules has been running around. Unsurprisingly, this echoes many of the planks of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Progressivism also added eugenics, family planning, population and birth control, public education, and more. Historically, progressivism is derived from the evolutionary ideas of the German philosopher Hegel. Most importantly to note, though, is that Hegelians understand the state to be the engine for establishing heaven on earth and the realm of absolute possibility. Hegel is famous for saying, the state is the march of God upon earth. And you'll notice that this is not a constrained vision of politics at all. Instead of Christianity's constrained political vision, progressivism is what Thomas Sowell called an unconstrained political vision. Brian Mattson defines it as one which human potential is not fundamentally hindered by anything. Humanity does not have any inherent obstacles or stopping human beings from developing their full potential, or even the whole of human society achieving perfect peace and prosperity. In the unconstrained vision, nothing in nature itself can ultimately hinder human potential and progress. The cosmos is a place of absolute possibility. Anything is possible, even establishing heaven on earth. It reminds me of Napoleon Dynamite with Pedro. If you vote for me, I will make your wildest dreams come true. Vote for Pedro. But added to this is what we might call progressivism's evil stepsister, cultural Marxism, that we've already heard a little bit about. Many Marxists were frustrated when World War I disproved their theory that instead of fighting a war for nationalist aims, the working classes would arise and throw off their capitalist fetters. That was their prophecy, that the workers would rise up and throw off the overlords, so to speak, when a new war took place. But that's not what happened. What happened was the working classes showed up for war because they loved their countries. So instead of discarding the theory, two Marxist theorists, specifically Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács, I think I'm saying that right, answered that the reason why Marxism failed was due to Christian blinders. The Christian faith had so brainwashed the working class of their true class interest. And unless Christianity and Western mores were destroyed, the communist revolution would never happen. And William Lynn says that this is when Marxism translated from economic to cultural terms. No longer was it just about abolishing private property. Now we had to enter the cultural realm. So what these two academics and an academic group of committed Marxists decided to do was take over the cultural institutions, the long march through the institutions, the schools, the media, even the churches, every institution that could influence the culture. And that long march through the institutions is what America has experienced, especially since the 1960s. I don't remember the number, but an insane amount of PhDs were awarded in the 1960s versus any other time combined. I don't remember the number, but it's insane. In other words, the world was in bondage to Christianity, and their long march through the institutions was seen as a great exodus out of Western culture and into the promised land of communism. They needed to first renew man from within by re-educating, regenerating, and liberating him from Western Christian civilization. Now, what does cultural Marxist regeneration and renewal look like? Well, according to Sidney Hook, it seeks renewal by emancipating man, quote, from repressive social institutions, especially economic institutions that frustrate his true nature, and to bring him into harmony with himself, his fellow men, and the world around him so that he can overcome his estrangements and express his true essence through creative freedom. A couple things to note here. There are institutions that frustrate his true freedom. All right? And he is in disharmony with his fellow men. All right? So these are a couple things to note here. And this is an echo of the great, what perhaps we could call the great-great-grandfather of progressivism, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, when he said, man was born free, and everywhere we find him in chains. But what were these chains according to Rousseau and according to these cultural Marxists? Well, are they chains of Christian institutions and God-given institutions like the family and the church and these various spheres that we've been given? Perhaps the most developed of all these statements, though, is from the Gay Liberation Front Manifesto. Listen to what they say. In their desire for equality with heterosexual marriage, equality is never going to be enough. What is needed is a total social revolution, a complete reordering of civilization. Reform cannot change the deep down attitude of straight people that homosexuality is at best inferior to their own way of life, at worst a sickening perversion. It will take more than reforms to change this attitude because it is rooted in our society's most basic institution, the patriarchal family. So whereas the basic enemy of socialism was private property, further up and further in, to pervert C.S. Lewis's quote, further up and further in, the most basic target of cultural Marxism is the patriarchal family. Now, this isn't merely a reordering of civilization, if you haven't guessed. This is an attempt to reorder reality, as Tim mentioned earlier. This unconstrained vision seeks to remake the world in its own image. As C.S. Lewis clearly perceived, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument, namely government as its instrument. One of the central ways progressives and cultural Marxists have sought to remake society is through the educational institutions. I don't know if you know this, but the UN has its own curriculum-setting arm, UNESCO, by which we are being slowly re-educated and thus, quote-unquote, liberated from private ownership, the natural family, and our Western cultural heritage. As an upshot of this, schools and libraries are now having drag queens read to them to desensitize our progeny. This fulfills the aspiration of socialist philosopher Bertrand Russell when he said, "It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is persuaded by the state with money and equipment. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in control of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." This is a complete reordering of civilization, indeed, and a complete denial of the American legacy of freedom. Freedom is protected in our Constitution. Declaration of Independence is a God-given freedom. Freedom is promoted in progressivism and cultural Marxism is liberation from God, from Western institutions, such as the natural family. Freedom, as promoted in our American heritage, was responsible stewardship, dominion and dignity created, imbued within us. Freedom in progressivism is the freedom to recreate or attempt to recreate by force. What's the way forward? What's the future of American freedom? How do we then begin to avert this crisis of American and Western liberty? Well, Philip Reeve said, "The death of a culture begins when its normative institutions fail to communicate ideals in ways that remain inwardly compelling." A culture dies when their institutions fail to disciple. Our normative institutions have not only failed, but been co-opted by this ideology of slavery. Statism has so permeated our shores as to leave almost nothing outside its grip, and I'm equating statism and progressivism here. This has become normative, and the state has become the single normative institution. Remember, progressivism sees society as one single body. What this means is that we cannot stave off progressivism and cultural Marxism merely by voting for a president that stands against it, though that's a good start. That's not bad. We can do that. As Tim said, we're not simply trying to get Christian people in office. That'll change everything. What needs to happen is we need to start with the church and the family. The church needs to unashamedly teach the truth. Not only teach the truth, but live the truth of the Christian worldview. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and it will set you free." It is the lies that bind us, that keep us in bondage. Lies about who we are and who we are not. What we are is created in the image of God, and thus we have dignity. And we are actually to rule like kings and queens on the earth, not be slaves to a few. That's the goal. The church needs to unashamedly teach this. Our children need to understand the church as a community of those liberated from sin and free to obey God, the author of freedom. One of the leading cultural Marxists, Herbert Marcuse, aimed to break the established universe of meaning by redefining everything. By the way, starting with sexual taboos. Think he's been influential? Our churches need to unashamedly preach the whole counsel of God, which is the protection of the established universe of meaning. Apart from God and his truth, we have no meaning. And they know that. Responsibility, thus, is the first step in the road to liberty. And churches can start to be responsible. Their pastors, thank God we have some good ones, preaching the truth. Secondly, families. Fathers need to begin again to lead their wives and their children. Recently, it was 2017, Rod Dreher wrote a book, The Benedict Option. And in many ways, it's a helpful book describing our need to form intentional communities of Christian prayer and worship, which will then be a culture unto themselves to then translate that culture out. You can't start out there forming culture. You've got to start in a culture of prayer and worship. But I think we need to add to this another option, what I want to call the Wiley option. Chris Wiley recently wrote a book called The Household and the War for the Cosmos. He argues that our vision of the family has shrunk drastically, basically becoming a recreation center. Now, prior to the Industrial Revolution, the family was much more than a recreation center. It was something that, as you can see, was worthy to be attacked. Now the family is not so worthy to be attacked. It's shrunk quite a bit. But then it was an integrated culture of work, much like a manor. You know, you think about a feudal society. You had these manors, and they had all these different responsibilities they took on. And their feudal lord was dependent upon them for these various goods, whether it was health or education or whatever. There's all kinds of things going on. It was the place of healthcare, business, education, hospitality, music, so on and so forth. And there's a reason that progressives want the Christian idea of the family erased. So what are we going to do to keep it alive? Responsibility, again, is the first step in the road to liberty. And families can start here, start taking responsibility. What about individuals? We'll end with Samuel Miller, where we began. To each of you, then, my fellow citizens, do you wish to stand fast in that liberty wherewith the governor of the universe hath made you free? Do you desire the increasing prosperity of your country? Do you wish to see the law respected, good order preserved, and universal peace prevail? Are you convinced that purity of morals is necessary for these important purposes? Do you believe that the Christian religion is the firmest basis of morality? Fix its credit, then, adopting it yourselves, and spread its glory by the luster of your example. And while you tell to your children and to your children's children the wonderful works of the Lord and the great deliverance which he hath wrought out for us, teach them to remember the author of these blessings, and they will know how to estimate their value. Teach them to acknowledge the God of heaven as their king, and they will despise submission to earthly despots. Teach them to be Christians, and they will ever be free. So repentance is the first step toward responsibility and the liberty that God has given us. Individuals can start here. Thank you.